Right, welcome to the D-Day Stories live stream. This is to mark Heritage Open Days, and we're going to talk about some objects that have been donated to us fairly recently. Just to give you a quick preview, we'll come back to most of these objects, or all these objects, in just a moment. But starting with this amazing carved fire screen that we'll tell you more about in just a moment. And then in front of it, you can see there's a soldier's diary. Well, you might think soldier's diary, that's not nice, but interesting, but not too unusual. But there's something really unusual about this particular one. And then next, we've got a message from a group of soldiers to a couple of ladies in the UK before they left for D-Day. It's a really interesting story there. And then moving on, a hat and medals that belonged to a landing craft crewman who didn't just serve in the D-Day landings, but served earlier in the war as well. And he's annotated his hat with a record of where he served. And then a message from, or exchange of messages between a Wren, a member of the Women's Royal Naval Service, who was based very near to us in Portsmouth, and an American soldier who was over in Normandy. So a great, really interesting series of messages. And first we're going to talk about this coat, which, this is live, so I'm just going to go and turn on this light, which we forgot to turn on. Smoothly done. So this is the first object we're going to talk about, but just to introduce ourselves first. So I'm Andrew Whitmarsh, I'm the curator of the D-Day story.
And I'm Charlotte Harding, and I am a marketing assistant for Portsmouth Museums.
And so this is the first item we're going to talk about, this coat, which as you can see is covered in badges. And this belonged to Elizabeth Lotary, who was a British woman who worked for the American Red Cross during the Second World War. And she started out working for the American Red Cross in relation to a club in London. So this was a place where American soldiers who were on leave in London during the Second World War could come have a place to stay and have meals, that kind of thing, and just have a bit of relaxation time when they were visiting London. And then later in the war, later in 1944 into 1945, she was doing various roles that were based on the continent. So she was, there's a photograph of her here, in fact. This is her American Red Cross pass that you're having a look at here. And so towards the end of 1944, she was described as the program director for the American Red Cross in Paris. So the American Red Cross, and actually, well, if you just look up at the coat here, you can see just on the shoulder here, there's her American Red Cross badges that presumably would originally have been on her own uniform, you imagine. So in Paris, the American Red Cross had 17 hotels with about 8,000 beds in total. So there were thousands. So this is obviously, we're now talking sometime after D-Day and after the Battle of Normandy. Once Paris has been liberated, Paris becomes a really important place for American soldiers to relax when they're off duty, when they're on leave. And the American Red Cross, again, is supporting, providing accommodation, things like that. And so Elizabeth Lotary was particularly working with US Army Brigadier General Wayne Allen, who you can see in the photograph here. So he was the general purchasing agent on Eisenhower's staff, so responsible for sourcing materials for the US Army. And the photograph, next photograph, you can see actually shows Elizabeth in later life wearing this coat. The collection of badges, many of them were collected by her during the Second World War, given to her at that time. We don't know too much about by who and by when, but some of them possibly she acquired a little bit after the war. And after the war, round about perhaps the time you can see in this photo, she was leading tours of the battlefields or sites on the continent for US veterans who are coming back and visiting. So just to talk through some of the badges on the coat. So they're all arranged in quite a logical way of different sorts of badges grouped together. So these are all badges that originally would have been on soldiers' uniforms. So here we've got, for example, badges of some of the different armies. So here, for example, the 1st US Army that was commanded the American Army forces on D-Day. And other badges on the front here are Army for Corps, so that's the kind of next unit down. Here you might have spotted this badge says 1984, and this refers to visits by some of the visits that I mentioned by veterans coming back, visiting the battlefields, and various other units going down as well. So some of these served in theatres other than Normandy, but there's lots of units that were in Normandy. And looking on the sleeve here, the right sleeve is all airborne units. So you'll recognise the Screaming Eagle of the 101st Airborne Division, quite a famous one there, for example, and various other airborne units. As I say, some were involved, of these were involved in the Battle of Normandy, and some came on later on. So that's the right sleeve, and just look at the other sleeve. You can see that there's various US Army Air Force units. For example, here we've got the 8th Air Force, which was the American Bomber Forces. And then moving around to the back of the coat, so these are all various divisional badges. So at the bottom here, these are armoured divisions, these triangles with the yellow, red and blue sections. And then all of these other badges higher up are all various infantry divisions. And up the top, we've got several units with a D-Day connection. So here you can see the US 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, for obvious reasons from their badge. And then down here, we've got the 29th Division, the blue and the grey, as it was known. So those two units landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. And then on this side, you've got this badge here, the US 4th Infantry Division, and it's Ivy leaves because the Roman numerals for 4 were IV. So it's a play on that. So this coat represents really all these connections during wartime and also after the war as well that Elizabeth Lotary had with these American troops. And apparently she kept in touch with many of them after the war. And it's really quite an amazing object with so much history behind it. And we counted, and there's about 130 badges on here, so it's really quite an amazing collection, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So just to move on to the next object now. This message you can see here was, well, I'll explain who the person relating the message first, actually. So the photograph shows Leading Wren Mary Goodwin. So she was based around the time of D-Day, and for several years, in fact, near us here in Portsmouth, in the underground headquarters under Fort Southwark, which is just north of the city. And there were tunnels dug there in 1942 from which the D-Day and the operations over in Normandy were coordinated and monitored. And she was operating teleprinters. These are basically produced messages like the one you can see here, where the message is actually printed out. So it's not voice communication where you're hearing the other person. You're actually getting a printed message. And this amazing message is actually an exchange of messages between her and an American soldier. So she was in, as I say, in Fort Southwark, near Portsmouth, and he was in Normandy. We don't know exactly when, but it's fairly soon after D-Day. And we're going to, without attempting any accents, we're going to try and we're going to read out the message because it's a bit hard to read. But reading out, you'll get more of a sense of the sort of what the message is like. So it starts with Mary Goodwin.
Hello again now.
What were you saying?
I was just thinking how extraordinary it seems to think of you out there and we are here going on practically the same as if nothing has happened. Have you got anyone else there?
Well, a pal has just popped in because the noise woke him up, but I've been alone since about 2.
Poor thing. Well, I hope he stays with you. It must be rotten not to have anyone to talk to.
That's not likely. He needs some sleep.
Yes, I suppose he must do. Well, maybe the noise will stop soon. I hope we get some sleep. Mostly kept awake by people either coming in or going out all night, but I suppose that's better than the noise you have to put up with.
I don't know so much. People dodging around would annoy me a damn sight more than this does. Anyway, it's quieter now.
Oh gosh, that's good. Anyway, I'll ask your guardian angel to keep an eye on you tonight.
Thanks, pal, but I guess you should have done that a bit earlier. The fun's over now, which presumably means that the dangers of D-Day have passed on and he's a bit safer now. It seems strange to be stuck in the back of a truck talking to you like this when I was over there such a short time ago.
Yes, it must seem rather like a nightmare and as if you were really still here and just dreaming about it.
Well, here's my relief now, so I suppose I better pack up. So long, pal. All the best. Thanks for your company.
Same to you. Hope it keeps quiet for a bit and you get some rest. Bye-bye.
So it's really like exchange. It feels really modern, doesn't it, to me?
It does, yeah. It's almost like a text exchange or WhatsApp messages. You can almost imagine it as the green, but it feels very modern and something that we could probably relate to today.
And this would probably have been officially discouraged because these are important operations going on, and people weren't meant to be sending messages for their own private purposes. But it feels like, to me, it's like a really human moment that, with all of these dangers around, here's these two people who never, almost certainly never met each other in reality, never knew each other's names, very possibly, separated by quite a long distance, but particularly Mary, based here in the UK, aware that this American soldier is in a difficult situation, a dangerous situation, potentially, certainly in the future, even if he's not in danger at the moment, and just keeping his spirits up, I guess, a bit, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well when he mentions about having been over here in the UK and that kind of how different it must have been for him to then be in a truck over there talking to her still here.
And because we're at the D-Day story, we're about D-Day all the time. You can kind of get a bit sort of used to it, I suppose. Actually, and actually, this is a reminder, really, of how, for the people involved, these were completely different experiences compared to the rest of their lives. Probably life-changing experiences, and so the American soldier probably had very possibly not even left his home state before now, and he's now over in Normandy. Mary also having gone through her REN training, that's the Women's Royal Naval Service, if I didn't say that before, and now she's operating this teleprinter. So people are doing really different things from what they're used to. Right, so just to keep on moving, we'll now look at the next group of objects. So these all belonged to Bert Brunt, who was a sailor in the Royal Navy. And I'll come to the hat in just a moment, but just to look at his medals first of all, and you see the photograph of him as well there. So his medals include the Africa, Italy and France and Germany stars. In other words, these are medals awarded for serving in each of those different theatres, which I think is quite a nice reminder of the fact that for lots of people, particularly in the Navy, D-Day and the Normandy campaign was only one part of a long war, and so Bert here has seen service in quite a few other theatres of war already, and his medals show that. And whereas for the army that was certainly true for some personnel, but other personnel who had been in the UK training for months or even years before they actually went over to Normandy. So the really unusual thing about his collection is his hat, and we'll see in just a moment. You will see that written on the top of this hat a whole list of the places that he served in throughout the whole of the Second World War. So he says starts with left England April 1942. He joined the Royal Navy in October 1941. So after 6 months or so, he's finished his training. He's left England, and then he's serving in the Mediterranean. So he mentions a whole series of places in the Mediterranean, North Africa. One of the particularly notable moments was in July 1943. He was serving on the ship HMS Ulster Monarch. So this was a big landing ship carrying smaller landing craft. He was the crew of one of the landing craft, and during the landings on Sicily, Operation Husky, he put ashore. His landing craft put ashore men of the Special Raiding Squadron of the Special Air Service, who they were assaulting an Italian gun battery to make sure that was captured and didn't disrupt the Sicily landings. Nearer to the time of D-Day, so he comes back to England in October 1943, and then on here, which will hopefully reconnect. So we had a bit of a blip there. Hopefully that's still carrying on okay. So as I was saying, on the top of this hat, Bert Brunt has written the names of all these different places that he served in, ending with the D-Day landings, and then after that the operations over in the Netherlands. So that will be later on in 1944, possibly into 1945. So as we're going along, we should say, if anyone's got any questions or comments, do put them in the chat for this. We're always happy to answer any questions. And if you're only just joining us more recently, so this is a live stream for Heritage Open Days, and we're looking at some objects that have been donated to the D-Day story more recently. And so not all of these aren't yet on display, and so some will be going on display later on.
Brilliant. So the next item that we're going to look at is a typed letter and a sweetheart badge. So this letter was given to Minnie Howe and her daughter Joan by troops around the time of D-Day. So the letter says, with the very best wishes for your future happiness and prosperity from John Robinson, Bob Stark, BDR Moffat, BDR Fisher, Sandy Powell, my ducks, and then in brackets, Arthur Dixon, thanking you for your kindness to my lads and myself and hoping that we all meet again in the very near future. Yours very sincerely on behalf of the above, A.H. Dixon. So Minnie had a small hotel on Westcliff in Bournemouth, and when the troops arrived on the cliff tops before D-Day, her and her daughter would take tea down to the soldiers each evening. And apparently the Home Guard tried to stop them, but one of the soldiers, a Sergeant Dixon, who we believe is the person that wrote this letter, escorted them down. So, yeah, we think that that's the person who signed the letter. And the badge is from the Royal Artillery, and that's the unit of the troops that were there. And Minnie's daughter Joan often wore this badge throughout her life, and her daughter had the letter read out at Joan's funeral.
So it's a really nice moment of a couple of civilians trying to make life a bit easier for these troops. I suppose they like we often come across this. They probably wouldn't have known that D-Day, or they certainly wouldn't have known that D-Day was going to be on the 6th of June, but there was probably been a sense that there was something big coming up. They'd been aware that that's why these troops had arrived in their area in Bournemouth, and they were just trying to make life a bit easier for them because they were knowing that they were going overseas quite soon. And I like this little sort of scenario you get of the Home Guard trying to enforce the rules and the sergeant saying, no, don't worry, it's okay, let them through.
Yeah, but I suppose that's as well because that meant he got his cup of tea of an evening as well. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, they always say the British troops need their tea. So
that's true. That's very true.
Very important, definitely. And then we'll the next item we're going to talk about. We'll show it to you in just a moment. Or in fact, do you want to just have a quick look at it and then we'll explain a bit more about it. So this, as you can probably see, this is a soldier's diary. It belonged to a gentleman called Leonard Duller, and he was serving in the 2nd Essex, which is part of the 56th Independent Infantry Brigade. So they landed on Gold Beach on D-Day as some of the, not in the assault waves, but came up a little bit later on as one of the reserve brigades. And so the start of the diary, in April 1943, he joins the army. He does training in signals and as a dispatch rider. On the 6th of June 1944, he writes, D-Day went into action, took Bayeux. They in fact took Bayeux on the 7th of June, but they were virtually there, so that's not going to split hairs. So far, perhaps not too unusual, nice, but not too unusual. And then it gets really quite unusual. 11th of June, he then writes, taken POW beyond Bayeux. So he was taken prisoner, in other words, by the Germans. And at this point, you might expect the diary to stop, because if someone was taken prisoner, often they'd have a lot of their possessions taken off them. They wouldn't necessarily be in a situation where they could keep a diary, keep it dry, keep it safe. So whether or not it was directly taken off them, they might well have lost it. But he actually went on to keep a diary for about 10 months through to the, or 10 or 11 months through to the end of the war, describing his experiences as a prisoner of war, having been captured in Normandy. So his first entry as a prisoner, he says, is 11th of June 1944. So let's cover that. That's when he's taken prisoner. His next entry, 12th of June, he says, moved to a farm in Normandy. And then 15th of June, helped put out fires started by RAF. So he's still quite close to the the Normandy battlefront. 16th of June, he's moved about 60 miles south, and then a couple of days later, he records filling in bomb holes. So he's been put to work. And then the 23rd of June, and you really have to, there's quite a lot of points here where you have to really feel for him. The 23rd of June, he writes, "So much seems to have happened to me in past 6 months when I was at Shanklin." So you can kind of picture him as a prisoner of war, thinking back to when he was before D-Day, when he was early 44 at Shanklin on the Isle of Wight, so not far from where we are now, and he's kind of reflecting on his situation. And it doesn't particularly improve from there, does it?
No, so from the 23rd of June, he's moved east, and he says 1 piece of bread and coffee all day. And then end of June to 1st of July, it's very much about the conditions that he's in with the other prisoners of war. So he says, like, feeling very weak, conditions inhumane, about 630 POWs in a badly ventilated barracks like rats. And then there's an entry that says boredom from looking at four walls all day, almost unbearable, in addition to no cigs and stuffiness. So, and in that time as well, it doesn't really mention work. So we can assume that obviously they were confined to barracks. And one of those entries in that time frame as well just says, cannot endure it much longer. So you really get a feeling of how dire the situation must have been for him. And on the 4th of July, he was moved further east by train, passing through Paris, spent about 2 weeks at Limburg in Western Germany. And then on the 5th of August, he arrived in an area of Germany where he spent most of his time as a POW. And then after that, he does start talking about work again. So he works in a quarry, which he described as not too bad. 1st of November, he talks about if they've heard anything. So he says, not getting much good war news, only rumours, still hope war finished by Christmas, disappointed no letters for me. 8th of November, this life is bloody awful, how much longer will it last? 16th of November, there's a little glimmer of hope for him in that he says, received first letter, happiest moment of my life. Then 23rd of November, received 5 letters from home, happy. So that just gives you an insight into what his life must have been like, but also that they were getting letters from home, but obviously few and far between. So it just shows you how important those would have been to him. So, but do you know how he would have got the letters?
So the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, did things like keep lists of prisoners of war, which he mentions at one point actually, filling in a card for them, and they would have done things like I think really this is a conduit for moving things like letters and parcels from the home country to the country that was holding the prisoner of war captive, and for which as he's saying it was really important for Moran, just for feeling he's got some connection home, because we're now pretty much at the end of 1944, so nearly 6 months after D-Day he's been prisoner for quite a long period of time, and then so he talks about snow over the winter, conditions really aren't too great, but then February 1945, he mentions thousands of prisoners of war being moved west as the Soviet armies are advancing. This was done so that essentially the Germans wanted to hang on to prisoners of war as long as they could, as I suppose possibly a sort of bargaining chip, or for that sort of reason. 25th of March, he writes, war should be over, and then in capitals, it isn't. Then in April, he's still being moved, another prisoner of war being moved further west. 18th of April, he says he only has potatoes to eat all day. And then the page that you can actually see there, that we've got it open as, it's a bit hard to read, but and I should just mention that the dates that I'm just about to read don't necessarily match up, and the reason is it's actually a 1943 diary, and he's used it again in 1944 and then in 1945, so sometimes he's changed the date. So 24th of April, he says, arrived Groppendorf 12 a.m, and then he talks about the moving in, and then he says, disarmed guards, freedom at last. So in other words, the prisoners of war, I guess, had a conversation with the guards saying, you sure you still want to carry on guarding us? And basically the guards have become the prisoners, and the prisoners have now liberated themselves. And then shortly afterwards, 27th of April, which is on the opposite page that you can see, he says, K rations, sick. Yanks girl did us well with donuts and coffee. So this, and then for several other days he talks about feeling sick, and the reason being that having had a really poor diet for a long time, people at that time weren't necessarily aware that you should then build people's diet up gradually, and instead they've been given coffee and donuts. So unsurprisingly, his digestive system is thinking, what on earth is going on? But he overcomes that before too long. And he would have been one of the last prisoners of war to be liberated, probably, because he was actually where he was liberated, or where he and his fellow prisoners of war liberated themselves, was roughly the point where the US and Soviet armies met. But it's a really amazing diary, because there's, again, so much sort of human, what's the word? A sense of humanity, a sense of the experiences that he was going through, and this sort of up and down of in really poor conditions, really feeling it, really poor morale, or that's probably being slightly unfair, but really fed up with the whole situation, and then getting some post and being overjoyed. So really amazing that this diary survives and has this whole record of him as a prisoner of war, isn't it?
Yeah, and he did keep it quite regularly as well. Like, there's not many, he doesn't miss many days, does he? He does write in it quite often, which is also probably quite surprising considering how tired and he must have been.
Yeah, so even if he hadn't had the diary taken off him, or had it destroyed just in all the, if he got rained on and soaked, or had things stolen or whatever, you'd think you'd have got just fed up with keeping a diary. So amazing that he did. Right, and now we're going on to our
our final object, which is this intricately carved wooden fireguard. So this was made by one of the deck crew on the self-propelled hopper dredger Foremost 18 while the ship was on the Solent just before D-Day. So Foremost 18 crossed to Normandy to use in a salvage role. So on the carving, you can see in the middle circle, at the top it says Foremost, which was the name of the boat. And then MN in the middle stands for Merchant Navy. And then in the circle on the outside is Cursails, which was Juno Beach. And just next to that, it says D+2, which was the intended departure date, which was June 8th. But actually, the Foremost 18 actually set sail on D-Day. So the fact the date's incorrect confirms that it was made in the window a few days between the ship's sailing date being known to the crew and D-Day. And this was bought from the man that carved it by Stan Jarvis, or Stanley Willis Jarvis, who was a young age 20 Merchant Navy officer, a fourth engineer. He had previously served in the Home Guard as he was in a reserved occupation making shell cases. But by the time of D-Day, he had been serving in the Merchant Navy for around 1 year. And while he was on the ship in the Solent, he had the temporary membership of the Cowes I can't pronounce the word, club, as a place to go and have a drink while waiting for D-Day. And in September, not long after the Battle of Normandy, while working in Boulogne, he was in a rowing boat when someone exploded a demolition charge under him. After a while, he had to retire from the Merchant Navy due to the effects of this. So post-World War II, he served in Palestine on his national service, and the screen was used by his parents for many years. So obviously this was a screen that would have been placed in front of a fireplace, in front of a fire. And according to Stan Jarvis, the Foremost 18 had been planned they would cross on D+2, but at the last minute it was decided to send the ship over on D-Day. But it's really, if you see quite closely, it's really intricate, all the designs, and the fact that somebody was sat on Foremost 18 on the Solent and I suppose had the skills and the time to create something so detailed is just quite astonishing, really, I think.
Yeah, and it's amazing quality carving, or seemed to me as a non-expert in that regard. But so I imagine what might be the case is that this is clearly someone who's done this kind of thing before, and maybe it was something that he'd been doing, that this other member of the crew had been doing for years. And he'd maybe make wooden items, sell them as a way of supplementing his wages, his merchant navy wages. But it's so great having this, as you mentioned, this D+2 on it, which shows that it was in that small window when the crew had been told when they were going to go, but not after they'd actually left. So which would one imagines only been maybe a day or so, which doesn't mean the whole thing would have been carved in a day.
But that particular bit,
that particular circular bit where he's put that information on would have had to been added then. And it's nice to have an object representing the merchant navy. So we perhaps often forget the merchant navy in the story of D-Day because there's so many different forces involved, but there are a large number, hundreds of merchant navy ships involved, and playing a really big part in all sorts of different roles. A lot of them moving equipment and vehicles, things like that, over to Normandy. Obviously, in this case, it's a salvage ship or a dredging ship. So it was used off Juno Beach, I think particularly for things like dredging harbours or just clearing channels perhaps, so that the harbours could be used by the Allied forces. So this has been a selection of objects that, as we said at the start, have been donated to the museum quite recently. Some of them will go on display quite soon, hopefully. Some of them perhaps not. We're fortunately been given so many objects that we can't put them all on display, but it's great to be able to bring them to you through means like this. This live stream, which, as we said, was to mark Heritage Open Days. I'll just double check if we've got any other comments or... So it's a question that people do ask quite a lot, or I think wonder quite a lot, is where we get the objects that we put on display. And the vast majority of them are given to us by, originally it was mostly by veterans. Now these days, sadly, because there are not so many veterans left around, normally veterans that is, mostly by the families of veterans, but we're always very grateful to those families who donate us these kind of amazing objects that we can use to tell stories at the D-Day story, or indeed in other ways as well. Thanks for watching, and do check out the D-Day Stories website and our other social media. Thank you.
Thank you.